Are we off? We're off. Right, evening everybody. It's Monday 28th of November, and two tonight that are very closely interlinked. So it's almost one and a half, and you'll find out why in a bit. So first one is Glenlossie, which I was doing Speyside alphabetically, so this should have been a bit earlier on, but the reason that I'm doing it with the next one is the two tie in. So Glenlossie, this donation, another Drinks by the Dram donation, was very kindly donated by James Goggin again, and the Glenlossie distillery itself is here, and it was set up by a guy called John Duff in 1875, and we actually covered off John Duff yesterday when we did Longbourn, because John Duff also set up Longbourn, but Glenlossie he did first in 75/76 when it first started going into operation, and he set up with a couple of business partners. He was actually a hotel manager or innkeeper, if you want to make it more romantic, who set up with a couple of kind of fairly important people within the town where his hotel was, that I can't remember where it is, and ran Glenlossie for about a decade before he decided to emigrate to South Africa with a view of opening a distillery in there. And it would have been the very first distillery in South Africa, malt whisky distillery anyway. But unfortunately, he was sort of obstructed by the South African president, who didn't want anything to do with the UK whatsoever. So he gave up on that. He moved to America, didn't have any success there. Basically, the distillery's all operational. Again, didn't really want anything to do with the UK at all. They were independent, they were doing their own thing, bugger off. So he went back to Scotland and came back to Scotland in 1892. Now, his business partners were already running the distillery in his absence, and it kind of like when he came back to Scotland, he didn't go back to Glenlossie. He decided he was going to try and set himself up again. So he was working in capital distilleries before setting up Longbourn and Benriach. So Glenlossie was kind of operating itself. It was one of the managers that had worked under Duff was running the distillery. They were still the business partners. And in 1919, eventually, because it managed to trickle its way through the Patterson crisis and the collapse of the market, which Longbourn and Benriach really struggled through. And in 1919, it eventually became part of DCL, Distillers Company Limited, which it's been with them in their various guises all the way through, and it's now with Diageo. So it's a fairly uneventful history. You know, it was built, it did okay at the turn of century, it got bought by DCL, as most places seem to have done, and just went through the process up to about 1971, where all of a sudden it was decided by John Haig and Co., because it was a very big part of the Haig brand, that they were going to open a new distillery, and they were going to open it within the grounds of Glenlossie. So this is a bit like Linkwood, where we had Linkwood A and B, a bit like Glenlossie and Brora, where we need to make more stock, we need to make more whiskey. Right, we're going to open a distillery, a bit like Kinninvie with Balvenie. You know, Kinninvie is in the grounds of Balvenie. It's basically you could just call it Balvenie B. As with Linkwood was A and Linkwood B, and one of them, more often than not, the newest version survives, and the other one just falls by the wayside or gets demolished. But the distillery in 1971 wasn't called Glenlossie. It wasn't Glenlossie A and Glenlossie B. It was another distillery, supposedly entirely, called Manachmore, and that is what I shall be doing next. So Glenlossie, on the other hand, still goes. And at one point, they were actually doing 6 months at Glenlossie, 6 months at Manachmore. It was the same teams that would just move between one distillery and the other. And apparently, I've never been, but apparently it's very, very difficult to delineate Manachmore distillery from Glenlossie. It's kind of within the grounds of it. And from the road, you can't tell the difference between one and the other. So, as this is from James Goggin, and most of the samples that he sent me have been boutique whiskey samples. So this particular one is Glenlossie Batch 1. It looks like this, 50cl bottle. You're looking at 118 bottles, and it's 52%. And it's getting quite hard to find. And believe it or not, the only place I found where I found the price for it was Amazon. Amazon is selling it for £109.50, I think they were selling it, plus £5 P&P. But I think it was about 80 quid-ish when they were selling it originally. Now, there is, or at least there was, a semi-official bottling from Diageo. It was part of the Flora and Fauna range, and it was a 10-year-old. That came out in 1990. Probably safe to say it's very, very hard to find now. It goes into Hague and it goes into Dimple predominantly, so they don't need to be selling it as a single malt. But it's always good to try these new things. Now, colour-wise, it's quite a nice colour, and I would be willing to bet, particularly with the boutique, that they've not added any colour to it as well. Now, it's 118 bottles at 52%, but it's batch. It's not. There's no age statement. There's nothing to say it's single cask or anything like that. It could be part of a cask, which is what some bottling companies do. Is they won't buy a whole cask. They'll actually buy part of one. They'll go, oh yeah, we want some of that. Now, up to the Longmorn, we were having a really good hit record with boutique whiskey, but the Longmorn was a bit of a disappointment. So I'm going to reserve judgment on this, but I am hoping it's going to be good. It is a nice, healthy amber colour as well. Oh, there's almost coffee on the nose. There's coffee and really rich, like almost roasted nuts. We're not quite getting to sort of chestnuts roasting on an open fire, although we get into that time of year, but there is a coffee nutty, it's like a hazelnut coffee feel, but it's not Starbucks sickly sweet, it's a proper coffee, proper percolated, rich, dark coffee, but it's got a nutty element to it as well. There's a slight rumminess to it as well, almost a bit of a hint of banana, but there's quite a bourbon character to this. Definite kind of a rich, dark Christmas cake fruit, real bourbony character. I'm willing to bet, I put money on this being bourbon matured. But again, there's this coffee element that's absolutely glorious. That is a fantastic nose. That's really, really good nose. But then I am a bourbon fan, and this is a very bourbony nose. And it's a very bourbony palate as well. Oh yeah. I tell you, if I tried this blind, I'd be going straight for bourbon. I'd be saying, yeah, that's a bourbon, that's not a scotch. Quite a rich mouthfeel as well. And it really coats the sides of your mouth. 52%, and I've got some water, but to be honest, I don't think it's going to need it. There is a bit of heat, but it actually works really well. And I think because it feels more like a bourbon, the heat is almost more acceptable, because you tend to find more heat with bourbon than you do with scotch. It tends to be a characteristic of bourbon, is having the heat, particularly with your slightly hotter, higher ABV bourbons, which a lot of people do go for. This, I'm not so much of a fan of that because I find it too fiery, but this is just striking the right balance, where you've got really good mouthfeel, a lovely, rich, there's a bit of maltiness to it. The coffee's much more subdued, but it's kind of there still. But this is very much dark fruit, dark Christmas cake, really, really rich and fruity and silky smooth. And the heat is just, it's lifting it, it's giving it a bit of character, it's giving it a bit of interest, but it's not overpowering the flavours. I really do think if I added water, I'm going to lose something, because to me this is just about bang on. That's glorious. To be more bourbon, to be more obviously bourbon, it would need more of a fruity character for me, but it's not too dissimilar. Oh, I like that. Oh, that's good. That's really good. It's warming, it's rich, it's quite decadent. It really is quite opulent. That the mouthfeel makes it feel richer than it probably is. If you're a bourbon fan, one to go for. It really is. It might be a bit too fruity and Christmas cakey for some Scotch drinkers, but there's a lovely, lovely, rich, warming finish. This is a dessert whiskey, and this is a dessert whiskey on a cold night. It's going to be cold tonight, apparently. I've just walked the dog. It's bloody freezing already, and it's only 10 o'clock, and supposedly we're going to be hitting minus numbers tonight. This is exactly that sort of thing. After a really nice meal, when it's absolutely freezing outside, and you want to sit in the warmth and warm the inside of yourself as well. I really like that. That is right up my street. As a bourbon fan, that is there. That's a perfect bourbon Scotch crossover as well. if you were looking to introduce somebody, but it's probably too bourbony. It doesn't quite have enough of a Scotch element to say, you know, if you like bourbon and you want to try Scotch, try this. Because I think if you liked bourbon and you tried this, you'd go, well, it just tastes like bourbon, I'll just carry on drinking that. If you like Scotch, but you're not a fan of bourbon, it's probably too bourbony. It tastes just like bourbon. It's not really straddling both camps. It's more of a bourbon than a Scotch. It is fantastic. There's a little bit of oakiness coming through on that one. There's a little bit of an oak character that's kind of making it that slightly Scotchy element, where you tend to get a little bit more of an oak character coming through. That last mouthful felt a little bit more Scotchy. Probably still not quite enough. It's still very much a bourbon whiskey to me. But I think that's fantastic. I think that's absolutely brilliant. Would I pay 110 quid for a 50cl bottle? Not sure. Not sure I would, but I am very, very grateful to James for sending me a sample of that, because that is fantastic. That is floating my boat and no mistake. It might not float your boat. If you don't like bourbon, probably not going to be up your street. If you find bourbon is too rich and too sweet, probably worth steering clear of that. But if you like bourbon, dishwasher, if you like bourbon, yes, you're going to like this a lot. Right, quick rinse out, then we'll have the other half of the Glenlossie distillery, which is known as Mannockmore. So I'll see you then. Cheers.